Good evening. Welcome to Central Presbyterian Church. I'm Ann Eichinger. I'm the pastor here. We are so glad you're here. We do ask that you turn off your cell phones, or at least put them to stun, so that we see who's getting buzzed. You know, you go like that. Yeah, it's a lot more fun that way. But that helps Daniel not to have interruptions as well. Unless God is calling. If God is calling, keep it on the ringer. And we can make arrangements for that. If you need bathrooms, which is probably the most important thing, down this hallway to your left. First door on your left is men's, second door is women's. If you need anything, there's several of us from Central here. We're happy to help you, but we are always, always glad to have Martin and the Faith and Culture lecture program here, and so we are glad you're here. Thank you for coming.
I printed this out earlier. Am I on?
Yes.
Hello? Hello?
There you go. Speak
There we
right
are.
into it.
Right into it.
Yeah.
I'm in the limelight. I printed this earlier and it didn't work, and so I'm going to read off my computer screen, which is a little different. I am delighted once again to be at Central Pres, and thanks so much to Ann and the congregation here for warm hospitality so many times for programs for the King Institute. My name is Martin Dotterwhite, and if you haven't met me before, please come and say hi. I direct the King Institute for Faith and Culture. We have some brochures, I'm guessing, somewhere around. Do we have brochures? I bet they do at the church, though. We have one more event coming up this fall, and I want to mention that briefly before I tell you about our speaker for the evening. On November the 18th, our final event for the fall is computer scientist Derek Sherman. Derek is professor at Calvin University in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and he is going to reflect for us something he's written about a lot, which is the connection between AI and faith. This is something that confronts those of us in education, but also in the business world and in the world at large, and it's one that is worth thinking about. Derek has been at this for a long time in terms of the technology, and also he is somebody of deep theological reflection. So if you can join us, he'll speak in the morning at King, and he'll speak in the evening at First Presbyterian Church on November the 18th. I also want to mention, before I forget, that we do have some of Daniel's book for sale. We have several of these at the back, and if you're interested in picking up a copy of One Lost Soul, which you will be after you hear the speech, they'll be available at the back. You may be aware that there's an election tomorrow. This is something that may have escaped your notice. And I didn't deliberately put this lecture about Richard Nixon before the election. You could write him in, I guess, if you want to. He's not on the ballot this time. But this is not an event that will tell you how to vote or what policies to pursue, but it will tell you what the call of grace looks like. And I think it is something that tells us a lot for not only a time of election, but for any time. Daniel talked about that habit this morning, the habit of empathy that is shaped by being a historian, that is also shaped by being Christian. And that is what pours off the pages of One Lost Soul, and it was certainly in evidence in his morning lecture today. Empathy is something that is necessary when studying a difficult person. Daniel spoke for us very kindly at a conference we ran last week called Storytelling and Vocation, and at Storytelling and Vocation, he called us to, as storytellers, to the use of empathy in talking about difficult people, which is, to be frank, all of us are difficult people. The subject of Richard Nixon is particularly interesting to me because I had an encounter with Richard Nixon at a very famous moment in his career. You look at me and you think, you cannot be over 30. Surprising as it is, I'm old enough to have had a Nixon moment. But there was one before I was born. My grandmother once met him on Roan Mountain. She was up at the Rhododendron Gardens on Roan Mountain. She met then California Governor Richard Nixon. They shook hands, and she said she never trusted him afterwards because he had a dead fish handshake. This was, in the American South, not a good sign. Not least because her husband, my grandfather, had a handshake that felt like the jaws of a toothless alligator. So it's through my grandfather my Nixon connection comes. In May 1970, my grandfather, Andrew D. Holt, then president of the University of Tennessee, leased Neyland Stadium in Knoxville to the Billy Graham Crusade for 10 days. It was one of his final acts as University of Tennessee president. He was planning to retire, and this meant a lot to him. He wanted to have Graham come to Knoxville. However, about halfway through the crusade, which was in May of 1970, on May 28th, an unexpected visitor showed up, who was Richard M. Nixon. Nixon had been invited by Graham to come, and the university was not apprised. It was Nixon's first speech since the invasion of Cambodia, his first campus speech since the invasion of Cambodia, and it was his first campus speech since Kent State. So the stakes were high. And Nixon had been advised that coming to Knoxville, coming to UT, would be a safe haven. Here he could come without the fear of protests. He could come and speak not only without the fear of protests, but he was going to speak in a stadium that held, at the time, 75,000 people. The opportunity was too good to pass up. My grandfather, who was blindsided by this, knew better. He knew there would be protesters, and sure enough, there were. There weren't a lot. Estimates vary between 250 and 500 people came. Some of them held up signs saying, "Thou shalt not kill." Some of them, one dressed as Moses with a sign that said, "Let my people go." I'm not exactly sure how that worked as a protest, but there we were. Several of these were arrested after the fact based on photo evidence, and a few had minor sentences. One faculty member, Charles Reynolds, appealed a $20 fine almost to the Supreme Court. Now, to many observers, this event was a significant one. It set a pattern for church-state relations to follow, a president coming to speak at a religious gathering with clearly political overtones. Graham did advise the president not to talk about politics, and yet in Graham's introduction he referred to the tough decisions that the president was having to make. No less than Gary Wills reported on this event for Esquire magazine. And it's not Wills's greatest moment. He's trying to be H.L. Mencken, reporting on the Scopes Monkey trial, and he gets nasty about the entire American South. He gets nasty about my hometown of Knoxville. And he labels my grandfather with something of a serene twice. Well, Granddad was serene, and in spite of the Nixon appearance hijacking the legacy of the Graham Crusade, he stayed serene through the event. But the legacy of the event maybe wasn't entirely hijacked by Richard M. Nixon that night, because perhaps what happened that was more important happened without any cameras or flash. People came to accept grace, to let their lives be transformed by the gospel. And one of the counselors on hand to help them was my mother, there at Neyland Stadium, and with her was her 2-year-old son, who was me. So I was there with Nixon in 1970. I have not, to my knowledge, been mentioned in any of the scholarly material of the event. Tonight, maybe we change that. Now, mostly I'm telling this story because I haven't had a chance to tell it ever before. But I'm also telling it because it shows the reach of Richard M. Nixon. It shows the complexity of religion in American society and the way that our stories weave together. Some of you may have even been there back in 1970. So, to tell us tonight more about this complicated person, Richard M. Nixon, and the way that he reached into American society and the way that American religion affected him and vice versa, we have Daniel Silliman. Daniel trained as a journalist on a crime beat in Georgia before following his wife, Beth Jarvis, who is here with us tonight, to Germany. In Germany, there was not a crime beat to be followed, and so he thought, why don't I do a Ph.D. in American history? Which he did at the University of Heidelberg. After postdoctoral fellowships at Notre Dame and Valparaiso, he took a position as news editor at Christianity Today magazine. Here he works as not only as news editor, but also as a reporter. Nobody who was in this room 2 years ago will forget his discussion of the Ravi Zacharias story that he broke. He specializes not only in reportage, but also in obituaries, and his obituaries are an art form in themselves and worth reading. He also finds time somehow, and at this point I turn a little bitter, because I don't know how he does all this. He also finds time to write books, like this one, to be part of the life of Hopwood Christian Church, to care for 3 cats, several chickens, and 40,000 bees, and to come speak for the King Institute. So he's a man of many talents. I know you will enjoy what he has tonight for us. Please join me in welcoming Daniel Silliman.
Thank you. Thanks, Martin. I talked this morning about pets quite a bit, and somebody asked me what the bees' names were. There's too many. We can't. They're just in a box. It's really nice to be here with you all tonight. Thanks so much for having me. Thanks, Martin, for asking me again, and Elizabeth for organizing things. And thanks to all of you for coming out on Election Eve. I want to talk today about Richard Nixon, Donald Trump, and us. I want to get into winning and losing and the politics of forgiveness, the problem of forgiveness for Nixon, Trump, and us. It is our problem, I think. It's a problem for our politics, our political discourse, the kinds of conflicts we have, and how we move through conflict to build better communities, solve problems together, and cultivate a world where people can live full, meaningful lives. I've been thinking a lot about Richard Nixon for the last few years as I wrote this religious biography, One Lost Soul, looking at the spiritual struggle of the 37th president. And a key piece of that spiritual struggle was that he couldn't ask for forgiveness. Nixon has always been somebody who fascinated me. You know, he's the one president who left in disgrace, who resigns. There have been a lot of bad presidents in 235 years. Nixon's the one who got forced out, the one who lost it all. Weirdly, this was also one of his campaign slogans, Nixon's the one. The phrase took on a meaning that he didn't intend. But he had these incredible victories and then even more incredible failures. Nixon, for example, I talked a little bit this morning about how he was the youngest vice presidential candidate for any major party. The youngest person ever nominated until J.D. Vance, and they actually are the same age. Vance is 39 right now, Nixon was 39 in 1952. Nixon served as vice president for 2 terms, a very popular administration, and then he ran for president on his own in 1960 and lost by the thinnest possible margin. It was a whisper. A precinct or 2 in Illinois, a few thousand votes in Texas, he would have won. He dreamed of that office in the White House for so long and worked for it and strove for it. But John F. Kennedy beat him by less than 1%, and that was that. He was the loser. Then he ran for governor of California in 1962, set his sights a little lower, let's try again. This time, surely, sweet taste of victory. But the race did not go according to plan. It was such a mess. Just to take one example, there was a whole scandal involving his brother, Donald, who maybe got a loan that he shouldn't have gotten to start a burger franchise, which they called Nixon Burgers. There was speculation the money was given to Donald as a way to get influence over Richard. There's no smoking gun in the scandal, or maybe smoking hamburger. But that didn't stop the speculation, and Nixon found huge chunks of his campaign dominated by Nixon burgers. It was just a mess of a campaign. So he lost again, and it was devastating. He felt that rejection. We don't want you to be president, America said. We don't want you to be governor. Dick Nixon, we don't like you. Nixon gave a speech the next morning, quite famously, after he lost. And it is legendarily sour. He ranted at the journalist at his press conference. You've had your fun attacking Nixon, getting in your digs. Well, that's all over. You won't have Nixon to kick around anymore. It was humiliating. It was embarrassing even to watch. One reporter at the time said it was like seeing a boxer get knocked down and count himself out. Another said he pulled the havoc down around his ears. He practically screamed at this stunned room, "Look at me. I'm a loser. I'm a loser." The word loser, incidentally, is one of Donald Trump's favorite insults. Maybe most favorite? There was a study of his Twitter usage between 2009 and 2016, and it found that he liked the words stupid, terrible, sad, of course, haters, dumb, dummy, but the winner was loser. He used that more than anything else. In the constellation of insults, the worst he can imagine, the most humiliating, is loser. Trump and Nixon are similar in some ways. Very different in a lot of ways, but similar in other ways. And on this point, they are identical. Nixon liked to quote his college football coach on sportsmanship. "Show me a good loser, and I'll show you a loser." I just think that's so incredible. Like, for him, the idea of good sportsmanship was a kind of a trick, right? It was deceiving you into accepting that you were a loser. You should not believe in there's such a thing as a good loser, because that's what people tell you when they want you to lose. So Nixon lost, the worst possible thing, in 60 and 62. And if there is such a thing as a good loser, he was not it. He was petulant, petty, resentful, spiteful, angerful, all the fulls. And he lost so bad. It was very clear at the time that that would be the end of the political life of Richard Nixon. Except that he came back. And this is one of the things that fascinates so many people about this particular president. Nixon lost, then ran again, and won. That doesn't really happen. In modern presidential politics, you lose, and that's it. Serious candidates don't get a second chance. Of course, the minor parties have their perpetual losers, who often imagine themselves as noble for losing. Your Ralph Naders, George Wallace's, Eugene Debs. But they're still losers. And major party candidates, you just lose once and then go away, which is why no one remembers Alf Landon, or Charles Hughes, John W. Davis, people like that. Even what Trump is doing now, nominated by his party for a second shot after losing a general election, is really unusual, and probably only possible because of the lie that he didn't lose. That lie allows enough people, probably Trump included, to live with the fiction and conjure this alternative history so he can run again and maybe redeem himself from the thing that he won't actually admit happened. But Nixon not only ran again, major party, he ran again and won. He's the one example in modern political history. Brushed himself off, got back up. If this were a sports movie, this would be perfect, right? We'd cut to the faces in the crowd, ecstatic, cheering, Nixon, Nixon. You know, it's an underdog story. He comes back, overcoming incredible obstacles. He won by about 600,000 ballots, a total of 301 votes in the Electoral College. And then he ran for re-election, 72, and won again. And his victory was even more complete. We're talking about a massive landslide that's unimaginable in America today. 17 million more votes than the Democrats. And Nixon carried every state except Massachusetts and D.C. I don't know who's going to win tomorrow, but nobody's going to win 49 states, right? That is not on the table. But 2 years later, Nixon goes down in history as the one president out of all the presidents forced to resign. Better to be outflanded, beautifully forgotten. John W. Davis. Nixon doesn't get that mercy. He becomes the name for scandal, a watchword for disaster and disgrace. Here's one example of how complete that was in Nixon's life. One of my favorite sources in the book, researching Richard Nixon, was a collection of oral histories that some college students did in Nixon's hometown, talking to people who grew up with him, knew him and his family when he was a kid. It's a fascinating source. I love oral histories. These interviews are great. There's basically a professor who later gets fired, maybe don't do oral histories, sending his students out to interview these people. And it's interesting, these are his hometown people. They're so proud of their connection to Nixon. They often say, oh, he's the kind of president he is because he came from here. He learned the lessons from this small town, these values. And as the interviews are happening, the Watergate trials are also happening. The bad stuff starts to come out. The scandals, the reports of school dirty tricks, backroom scheming, and then all the swearing. Nixon's presidency starts to slide towards resignation, and suddenly the neighbors in this oral history start to talk a little differently. You can almost track it day by day. Suddenly they don't claim him so much. One of them even says, like, I don't know where he learned that stuff. Must have been a duke. But suddenly the people who grew up with him, who until a minute ago had been really proud that he was their people, are acting like they don't even know him. That's the extent to which he's losing. And that's the part that fascinates me. He lost, won, and then lost again. Lost worse than if he just lost the first time. Not to be forgotten by history, but remembered as a loser. And who defeated him in 1974? Beat him in this total, devastating, show me the definition of a loser in a dictionary kind of way? He defeated himself. Nixon obsessed about his enemies, fixated on them, started doing what he imagined they were doing, started justifying what he was doing based on the logic of, well, they did it first, logic that your mother warned you about. And then Nixon went and became this person who was his own enemy, who was the person how he imagined his enemy, and then he defeated himself. He did this in two ways. First, he promoted men and surrounded himself with men who would go beyond the bounds of law for the sake of the cause, getting him reelected. He didn't specifically tell them to go beyond the bounds of the law, but he did urge them on and say things like, someone ought to do something. I have a memo where he said someone ought to do something about the Watergate office that they broke into. The someone in that memo was a guy named Chuck Colson. Colson famously said he'd run over his own grandmother for Nixon. He later claimed that was his joke. As far as I can tell, his grandmother did not think it was funny. But there's this memo, and Colson did something, which was hire an ex-CIA agent turned spy novelist who assembled a team that broke into the Democratic Party headquarters and put listening devices or plugs on the phones, the historic Watergate scandal. Nixon and his men did that to get an unfair advantage in an election that he was going to win, and win by a lot. Sometimes historically we miss this fact. It's really strange that he's breaking the law to give him an unfair advantage in an election that he's going to win 49 out of 50 states. It doesn't make sense. But it is a way to defeat yourself. Nixon foiled his own success and snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. He probably could have survived that, though, if he hadn't done a second confounding thing and found another way to defeat himself, another way to become his own enemy. Nixon bugged the Watergate. He also bugged himself. He planted recording devices in his own office, like he had done in the office of his enemy. Normally when we say someone is their own worst enemy, we mean it in kind of a vague way, right? Like, they made some bad decisions. But in this case, he really did it. Just to add to the irony here, the bugs in the Watergate didn't work very well, and they didn't really pick up anything. They didn't get anything of value. But the bugs in the White House worked really well. They recorded a lot, and they caught Nixon lying and scheming, trying to cover things up, obstruction of justice. He offered to pay bribes, at one point saying, "How much do we need? $1 million? I could get $1 million." He was a way better enemy to himself than he was to his opponents. This is the kind of thing I've been thinking about for the last few years, and why I had to write this religious biography. It's so bizarre how he defeated himself. And you just think, why would he do that? And right there, I feel a twinge of recognition. Oh yeah, I do that. Maybe it's just me. Maybe you do it too. But sometimes I make decisions that if I thought about them, I would know are going to be bad. I should know. I worry that in some times and instances, I am trying to defeat myself. A lot of that's my brain, the number one enemy. Sometimes I can convince myself for no reason that the people who love me don't love me. That's me defeating me. Sometimes I get in arguments with people in my head, and I'll go around and around getting so angry, so frustrated that I'll ruin my own day. That's not the person I'm mad at. Like, they're up picking flowers or something, right? This is me in an argument with myself. I've also found I can take the other person's side in an argument and win, too. I'm pretty good at that. Nixon once introduced himself to a group of people. This is when he was president. Just walked up and there was a group of people that weren't expecting to see him. And he walked up and the first thing out of his mouth, he said, "I know you probably think I'm a son of a bitch. I want you to understand, I know exactly how you feel." I've had that, You walk into a room and you're like, I don't think these people like me. They haven't done anything. That's me defeating me. And then I think a lot about how Richard Nixon did not want a presidential pardon. This is a curious part of the story. Nixon was pardoned. He resigned, got replaced by his Vice President Gerald Ford, and then Ford granted him a complete pardon. So Nixon didn't have to go to court, wasn't prosecuted for anything, just got out of jail free. Retroactive immunity, go on your merry way. A lot of people thought at the time that there was some kind of dirty deal, the VP pardoning the P, making sure that he never paid any price, maybe in exchange for letting him be president. There was reporting at the time that investigated this and looked into it. We know now, with the access to the archives, that's not what happened. This is the benefit of history. We can go back to our suspicions and examine them more thoroughly. It would make sense that this was a dirty deal, but actually, Ford had to kind of twist Nixon's arm to even kind of confess to give him his pardon. He actually, and this is amazing to me, tried to give it back. He called Ford a few days later. This is the only American president to get a pardon. He gets this incredible get out of jail free card, and a few days later he calls Ford and says, "I'm sorry, can you still return it? Did you keep the receipt?" It's a really awkward phone call. Nixon had to call the person who gave him a pardon on the phone and call him Mr. President, which a few days before was his title. And now he's addressing this other guy the way he wanted to be addressed. And he hemmed and he hawed because it was awkward, but finally got to it. I don't want to be forgiven. I don't want to ask for forgiveness. Here again, we see a similarity to Trump. Both men have won, both have lost, both have this incredible horror and revulsion at the idea of losing, of being losers, and both reject the thought that they should ask for forgiveness. Back in 2015, the first time he was running for president, Trump spoke at the Family Leadership Council in Ames, Iowa, to a group of conservative evangelicals, very religious churchgoers. And they asked him about his faith, and he said the kind of platitudes that politicians say: faith is great, it's the best, I love Christianity. The moderator pushed a little. He came up with what I thought was actually a very good question. He asked Trump whether he'd ever asked God for forgiveness. And Trump said, "No, I'm not sure I have. I just go on and try to do a better job from there. I don't think so. I think if I do something wrong, I just try and make it right. I don't bring God into it." For evangelical Christians, asking for forgiveness from God is such a basic part of faith that this is a kind of an incredible answer. So he's been pushed several times more to say that he's asked for forgiveness. Think of maybe one example where he said he was sorry to God. One time he responded, "Why do I have to repent or ask for forgiveness if I'm not making mistakes?" Another time, "I am good. I don't do a lot of bad things." Finally, the last time someone pressed him on this, he said, "I will be asking for forgiveness, but hopefully I won't have to be asking for much forgiveness." I love that he's like, I'll get to it in the future. I will be asking for forgiveness is such a strange thing to say. But why? Why can't he say, "I've asked for forgiveness. Here are some examples." Or even, "I do ask for forgiveness. Right now, let me go ahead and do it. Here's some things I'm sorry for. Will you forgive me?" On the one hand, that's not that hard. On the other hand, for him, it appears impossible. Because you have to say you did something wrong to ask for forgiveness. You have to admit to failing, to failure, to being a loser. And if that's the worst thing you can imagine, your worst insults, then you cannot, under any circumstances, ask for forgiveness. I don't hold out much hope that Trump is going to change. He's 78. I don't know what is going to happen tomorrow, but it seems unlikely. If he wins, he will suddenly start confessing his sins, admitting his faults. If he loses, I sincerely hope he can publicly acknowledge that, even if he doesn't accept responsibility and blames other people. Just saying, "I lost." One of my deep fears for America right now, after what happened in 2021, the mob violence, is what happens if he can't say, "I lost." But I haven't seen anything that hints at the possibility that he can, at this late hour, become the kind of person who admits to making mistakes. Nixon never could either. He ultimately accepted the pardon kind of grudgingly, vaguely mumbling something, but then when there was opportunities later to say that he was sorry and ask for forgiveness, he didn't. It seems like he couldn't. There were opportunities. In the book I write about how he almost died right after he resigned the presidency, pulmonary embolism. And he ended up in the hospital, and the doctor got a Catholic minister, actually an archbishop, to come and talk to him. And Nixon wasn't interested. The archbishop actually gave Nixon a gift, a cross, and Nixon gave it to the doctor. I don't know of a clearer sign of rejecting the cross than getting a cross and giving it to somebody. You had it. There was a rabbi, too, who came around. And he could have asked for forgiveness. There were opportunities. I can tell you how this worked out for Nixon. Not well. He ended his days in bitterness, resentment, and isolation. He said he liked it this way. He was fueled by his hatred. I get up in the morning to spite my enemies. That's one way to live, but not a good one, not a kind one. But here I want to ask, should we maybe feel a twinge of recognition? Is it just Nixon and Trump who struggle to say they are sorry, or is this something more widespread among us? A social problem that we're all living with, those who have a lot to apologize for, and those who have just a little. Maybe it's not just them, but us too. There's been so much talk in recent years about the danger of cancel culture. There's this idea that people make mistakes and are unfairly punished, excessively punished, when maybe they should be forgiven so everything can go on as it was before. I don't agree with that. That's not really what I'm talking about here. My argument is not that we have a big problem because we as a society have not forgiven Donald Trump or Richard Nixon or any of the perpetrators of Me Too. Consequences are in fact appropriate in a society. And the problem, I think, to the extent that there is a problem, is that consequences come down sporadically, unequally, and inconsistently. We don't have a system that consistently holds people to account for bad behavior. But Nixon should have been held to account. Whether or not he ever asked for forgiveness, it is good and right and appropriate to hold people to account. But they should also ask for forgiveness. It would be better for them and better for us if they could ask for forgiveness. And it would be better for us if we could sometimes say for ourselves, I am sorry, I messed up. There was, of course, a context for my mistakes. There was provocation and extenuating circumstances. And my heart and my intent wasn't like that. But it was bad. I did a bad thing. I crossed a line. I was a person I don't want to be. I'm sorry. We need to be able to say things like that personally for our own sakes and socially for America's sake. For the sake of our politics and our lives together, we have to be able to admit faults, starting with small ones, and say that we want to be forgiven. I guess what I'm saying is, don't be like Nixon. Don't be like Trump. Find a way to ask for forgiveness. Maybe start small, but ask for forgiveness. If we're going to live together, we need to find a way to do this. I was on a plane this summer, flying to a wedding, and I got annoyed at the guy sitting next to me. Those seats in the back are so small. And this guy fell asleep immediately on the plane and leaned on me the whole time. I could feel his sweat at some point in the flight. Sort of no respect for personal space. Which there isn't any anyway, so I don't know what I was expecting. And then when we land, everyone's getting off, and as finally gets to our row, and he stops to take a phone call, and stays in his seat to talk, and I'm trapped in the... And then he finally gets out, and he turns around and is like checking, like maybe I left something in the seat. So he finally, and then he comes back. And I got really annoyed. I kind of exploded and just said, come on, man. I didn't mean to. I didn't even know I was going to. It was just, come on, man. Some of us are trying to get off this plane. And then he got mad and said something back at me. Pretty aggressive, and then just sort of glared at me. And you know what I didn't do? I didn't apologize. I didn't say I was sorry. Like, yes, he was inconsiderate. He was, but I didn't need to be impatient. I didn't want to be impatient. I let myself get annoyed, and that's not who I want to be. And I could have said, you're right, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Even walking through the airport later, I was angry with him and arguing why I was right in my head, justifying myself, ruining my own day. I had to let it go. An uncomfortable flight is just an uncomfortable flight, but there I am still in it, winning a decisive, definitive victory against myself. But why couldn't I ask for forgiveness? Even in my own mind later, I found it pretty hard. I think I didn't want to be a loser. That's that Nixon thing. That Trump thing. The shame that cannot admit to any mistakes, ever. It felt like standing over an abyss looking down, and one peep of an apology would just tumble me over, and I'd fall forever. It's this fear that once you lose a little, you will lose for all time, and you're a loser. That's in me. Maybe it's just me, but I don't think so. We have some big political problems in this country, and I think this is one of them. The problem that we have trouble even admitting faults, ever saying sorry. I think it's deeply connected to the bigger problem of social trust. We live in a time of fraying social trust. You can see this in the challenge of misinformation and disinformation in America. The world is so big and fast and complicated that it's hard to know things. And then some people exploit that very effectively, which makes the problem even worse. We get disinformation, also known as lies. In a world where it's hard to know things, in part because some people are lying, people find other strategies to navigate complexity. And one readily available option is just picking a side, picking a team. You trust your team, the good guys, and you treat everyone on the other team with complete skepticism and suspicion, which makes the information problem worse, incidentally, and also pours fuel on the polarization that we're seeing now, where people are completely alienated from their neighbors and from their fellow citizens. We feel like we can't trust them, but if that's true, we can't trust them, then how can we live together? Democracy depends on us being in it together, making mistakes because we're human, but being in it together. When people do trust each other, one place you see that trust is their ability to admit mistakes. If you're not locked into the death spiral of a culture war, a zero-sum battle to vanquish your neighbor forever in the next election and then we won't have to do it anymore, if you're actually trying to live together, then you will have people saying, I'm sorry. Those are people who believe change is possible, because trust is possible. And that can start with the vulnerable step of saying, I'm sorry, and trusting that others will not take advantage of that, but respond in a way that moves us forward to something better. Forgiveness, it seems to me, is the canary in the coal mine of our decaying social trust. Forgiveness is a political problem. It's Nixon's problem. It's Trump's problem. It's my problem. It's our problem. Recently, the magazine I work for, Christianity Today, read an article by a writer calling for COVID amnesty. The argument was that we as a society didn't know what to do in a pandemic like that. It was a new experience, and our responses to it were not all 100% correct. People overreacted. People got anxious. Anxiety was completely reasonable, but still we acted out of our anxiety and sometimes overreacted, and we made guesses about the right response to the situation. Masks, vaccines, social distancing, those plexiglass barriers at the grocery store. Maybe we made the best guesses we could, but they were guesses, and they weren't all right. At the same time, the writer said, we tended to judge other people's not right guesses quite harshly. Too often, we didn't look at people who made different decisions than us and say, I bet they're doing the best they can. We said things like, how selfish, how stupid, and ugh, those people. And maybe, and I want you to hear me on this, maybe those people were being selfish and stupid. But if you can start from yourself for a moment, if there's any place where you could say, hey, I didn't do that perfectly, but I also didn't extend enough generous interpretation to other people who also didn't do it perfectly, so I'm sorry. The writer said that we're now at this point where no one is willing to apologize, even in a limited way, just for their part. And so we're kind of locked into this struggle over this experience that we had. We're locked in these recriminations. He proposed maybe we could just kind of wave our hands a little bit and say, mistakes were made, passive construction. Abracadabra, amnesty. I have to tell you, people hated this piece. Regardless of where they stood on whatever issue with COVID, they were completely convinced that other people were worse. So much worse. And the idea of losing to those people was so deeply upsetting. We are not going to be the losers. But that's that Trump thing. That's that Nixon thing. The fear of losing that guarantees, collectively, we will all lose. Unless, somehow, we can take a tentative step towards a politics of forgiveness. A politics of asking for forgiveness, especially when we're not the worst offenders. Even when we don't bear all the faults. We can still say, this part was my part. I'm sorry. I don't want to be like Nixon. I know how that turned out, so let me say, for my part, I'm sorry. My argument is that if we're waiting for the worst people to start this and take the first step out of the spiral, I think we're doomed. It has to be the best people, right? It has to be the people secure enough and strong enough to take the risk of being a loser. I don't know how it will work. I don't know if we can do that. Even good people, people of goodwill, good hearts, well-intentioned, trying our best people. And if we do it, I have to admit, I don't know if it'll work. Maybe social trust is too broken. Maybe we're all Nixon now. Maybe all of us, regardless of our politics, have Trump in our hearts. But this is my best idea. So this is what I'm going to try. Jesus once told his followers that they would be forgiven in proportion to how much they forgave others. Forgive as you want to be forgiven. Augustine, the great Christian writer from the 5th century, asked people to imagine they were in a little boat taking on the water. He said, this short sentence is your bucket. Grab it with both hands and start bailing. Forgive others, bail. Forgive others, bail. Do you want to be forgiven? Bail. Say you're sorry for a small thing. This is the bucket we have. Thank you.
We have time for some conversation and questions. I do want to remind you, first off, before anything else, if you ever sit next to this man on flight, please don't fall asleep on him. Just, he'll be nice about it, but don't do that. It's not good. Any questions, comments?
Next time I'll be nice about it.
Daniel, can you comment some on Pat Nixon's influence?
What about her influence?
Well, my wife is my best guide to asking for forgiveness.
They didn't have that kind of relationship. Yeah, they didn't have that kind of relationship. I don't know. I don't know if Nixon let anybody be in his life the person who could tell him that he had, Like, I don't know that this is her fault. I don't know that he would have allowed it, or he would have married her if she was that kind of person. Yeah, their relationship's a little bit hard to get much of a grasp on, though. It's pretty, I mean, one interpretation is that it's very private, another interpretation is that it's mostly non-existent after they sort of get to the White House. You can, in the records, find exactly how many minutes they talked every day. They like kept a log and they would say, talk to his wife, 6 minutes. But what was said in those conversations, we really don't know. But I don't have the impression that there was anybody in Nixon's private life who sort of said, you know, you're being a jerk, go say you're sorry. Yeah.
I think I was reminded that Nixon was a Quaker, his background, which,
Yeah.
I don't know, implies a lot to me, but
I have a book for you. Yeah. Nixon did not learn grace in his Quaker church. He learned work. He was an evangelical Quaker to start with, and later became a liberal Quaker in college by his own understanding and definition. Oddly, the thing that did not change was how you be a good person, which is you do good things and you do work. The idea of forgiveness being a sort of core to your Christian identity, that you're someone who's been forgiven, was never part of his religious understanding. And it's a little bit hard to tell if, like, he missed it, right? To the extent that I can tell, the church actually didn't teach that. They taught, be a good person, work really hard, earn your right to be a Quaker, earn your, Christian bona fides. But it's, I don't know, maybe he just didn't, maybe he missed that in Sunday school or something, I don't know.
It seems strange to me that with one of the people who's advising him being Billy Graham,
Yeah.
who at the end of every crusade has people sing just as I am without one plea.
Yeah.
It's all about saying sorry.
Yeah.
Is that just not part of their relationship, or how does that work?
Yeah, so there's kind of the whole relationship with Billy Graham is pretty fascinating, but I guess I want to say 2 things about it. One is that Graham was really tentative at ever pushing Nixon. So he often would say, like, remember to read your Bible and remember to go to church more often, but he didn't sort of have these like hard-hitting conversations. He seemed wary of losing his relationship to Nixon. And probably, honestly, he would have had one conversation where he told Nixon and that would have been it. That seems to be his sort of MO at that point. The other curious thing, and I don't know if any of you can relate to this, but Billy Graham tended to get distracted by politics. And there's at least once in the record where Nixon explicitly tells someone, hey, Billy Graham is trying to talk to me a lot. Would you distract him with politics? Like, could you have him read some polls or something? Like, please talk to him about politics so he'll stop trying to tell me spiritual stuff. His biographer, Grant Wacker, told me that he really does think of politics as kind of an addiction for Billy Graham, and he can resist for a while. He sort of white knuckles it and gets on the wagon, and then he falls off the wagon and gets political. And you can see that in the conversations with Nixon. Like, he calls intending to talk about spiritual things, and then the news of the day or how people in South Carolina might be trending, and he just gets distracted, which I think at this time of year feels not unfamiliar to us.
We all know that Chuck Colson had a dramatic transformation.
Yeah.
I'm interested in any interactions they had after that transformation.
They talked at least once after Chuck Colson's dramatic born-again experience. He didn't hold out a lot of hope that Nixon might change and didn't get a huge opportunity. Curiously, Colson seemed ready to think that lots of people were going to change, including G. Gordon Liddy. At one point he's like, I think G. Gordon Liddy might be becoming a Christian. It's like, no, that's not happening. For those of you who don't know G. Gordon Liddy, that's crazy. But no, he didn't have, I mean, anybody who was like pushed out over Watergate didn't get a lot of opportunity to come back and talk to. Nixon, but it's not clear to me that he would have gotten an opportunity even if he pushed. So part of the end of the book, I sort of traced, like, here are the people that had the opportunity, here's what they said, here's how Nixon rejected them, right? There are multiple moments, including that Catholic archbishop, there's a rabbi, there's a son of a Methodist minister. Like, it's almost like a Baptist preacher joke, how many people show up to tell Nixon, like, hey man, you need Jesus? And he doesn't, right? I mean, he does need it, but he's not interested in that conversation. So, at one point he says he considered converting to Catholicism, but that's sort of the closest he gets.
I feel that with politicians or political figures, it's hard for us to, as civilians, feel like they're accessible.
Yeah.
I'm interested why you chose such a prominent political figure to make an argument about forgiveness when it's sometimes hard to relate to them.
That's a good question. I often end up really identifying. We don't have a lot of access to them, but we do often end up really identifying with them, right? Like, part of the way presidential politics works is people invest their own identity and hopes and dreams and fears in the sort of vessel of that political candidate. So I think, we don't think, like, I can imagine hanging out with this person, and yet they are often, there's a lot of us in them and in their public profile. Part of the reason I wrote the book was because Nixon is very weird, and I kept seeing bits of myself in the ways that he was weird, and that was part of what I wanted to explore. Like, wait, what is he doing? And I hope that, if I came up and told you a story about my friend Joe and how he was bad and should ask for forgiveness, like, you don't know that person, right? So I'm hoping that I can tell the story in a way that you would both say, I don't want to be Nixon, and also, oh yeah, I see how I kind of am a little bit, right? So I'm hoping that it works that way.
My voice is going a little bit, so I apologize in advance. My question is about sort of the culture of mercy, both in the families of both of these men.
Yeah.
One grew up in a sort of works-based Quaker environment, the other grew up in the Church of New York real estate.
Yeah.
And then also the relationship that the church has in culture with mercy and creating. I don't know that right now, if Trump were to have, for instance, he loses tomorrow, he begs for forgiveness, he says he's turned his life over to Christ, does the church, and by extension, the broader public, accept that?
I don't know. That's not something I'm worried about happening. But I do think I would want to separate the church and the broader public. Like, I would like it to be possible for any major figure to walk into a church and say, like, I'm sick of being me, can you help? Like, I've done, this is all I got, like, please do something. And we do see that happen on occasion. I think if you go back and look at, for instance, Justin Bieber's baptism, it's pretty clear he'd been Justin Bieber way too long, and he needed some grace and really believed in that. I hope that there are churches that will be those places and can actually create a private space for that person to be that, and not it be a rehabilitation for public life, right? Part of the problem is, like, once you're famous, you just got to get back to being famous again, and you do need someone to say, like, yeah, we're going to do some discipleship, and you're just going to be the person who sits in pew number 3, So I don't know. I don't know what would happen, and I don't know that a church could do that for Donald Trump if he did do that. But I would like to separate the the question of how is the public responsible for responding to that, and how could a church maybe respond to that?
Martin. How about the Elvis Nixon meeting?
Yeah, it was amazing. No one was forgiven, but it was a truly fantastic moment. For those of you who don't know, there's a moment where Elvis Presley shows up at the White House randomly and says, "I'd like to come in." And you don't normally accept random visitors at the White House. That's not how it works. But he's Elvis Presley, and Nixon's like, "Yeah, I got a Tuesday afternoon. Let's have Elvis come in." Elvis asked to be deputized so that he could fight the war on drugs. It's pretty clear from the story that he was on drugs at the time, or something. He has a gun on him. They take it off, and he's like, "Yeah, but what about the other one?" Yeah. It's a wild scene. There's a lot of stuff like that in Nixon's life. Like, one night he woke up in the middle of the night and decided to go to the Washington Memorial. Just left the White House and went for a walk down the street. Everyone freaked out. He found a bunch of college students and talked to them about how you really got to travel more. You know, you got to get out and see the world. They're like, am I high? This is There's a lot of stuff like that. It's weird and fun. The 70s were a very strange time.
70s.
Yeah.
Other questions, comments?
I think I was born the year that Nixon had resigned, but it seems like when I was in high school or maybe my middle school years, he has sort of been rehabilitated. You will see on a lot of news programs. Can you speak to that a little bit of that experience?
Yeah, so he spends the kind of entire end of his life trying to get back into some kind of public space. He rejects forgiveness, he re-gifts the cross, and then he spends all of his time trying to get back on TV, writing books, and tries to be seen as sort of a foreign policy expert. For the people who admire him and who hold him up as a hero, this is an example of how he is always someone who gets back up again, right? This is the noble story of the underdog who's never down. You can never count him out. He's always going to come back. I think another way to view it is he sort of needed that, right? The only way he could feel okay about himself was in that kind of public space, and when he got some kind of public accolades. It's interesting. He essentially tries to talk to every single president after he's out as let me give you advice. He would sort of call and see if he can offer some advice, mostly about foreign policy, which he considered himself a foreign policy expert. The first person who decided he did want to talk to him was Bill Clinton. And he and Bill Clinton developed a quite fascinating friendship where they talked for hours on the phone about foreign policy. And Clinton, as a child of the 60s, as a leftist who, Hillary Clinton worked to impeach Nixon, and Bill's suddenly like, he's got a lot of interesting things to say. But yeah, he works really hard to be acceptable in some of those spaces.
How did his daughters relate to him?
Yeah.
How did the daughters relate to Nixon and the scandal and the history?
His daughters loved him a lot. One of them was really shy and tried to stay out of the public as much as possible. And one of them became the kind of de facto spokesperson for the family and tried to defend him and tried to protect him as much as possible. but that's really a story. Her role sort of comes in at the very end of the presidency and then in the post-presidency era. So it's in the disaster part that she's trying to like protect him. And I don't get the impression that he actually let her, right? She's sometimes allowed to be the spokesperson, especially in the darkest days of the scandal. She was allowed to kind of make statements for the family, but otherwise not too much. Yeah, I think it was probably pretty hard to be one of Nixon's daughters. I think that was a tough assignment. Yeah. One of his daughters writes a biography of Pat Nixon. That's quite good and pretty interesting.
We're talking about Nixon and Trump. I think it's fair to say that anybody that runs for the presidency of the United States has a strong, I don't know if I would say healthy, ego.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Could you have given this lecture on most of the other presidents? Now, what's an example of a president who stands up in front of the country and says, I'm sorry, I made a terrible mistake, I beg you to forgive me?
Yeah, I actually think a lot of other presidents, I think it's actually not an abnormal part of politics to go, oh, I messed that up, or I thought it was this way, and I meant to do this other thing. I mean, just to stick with Republicans, I think George W. Bush apologized multiple times for, I didn't understand something, or it was more complicated than I thought, or, yeah, maybe I could have listened to that person more, something like that. I 100% agree that like one has to have a crazy amount of confidence to think I should be in charge. That's strange. But yeah, I think a lot of other presidents. I think Joe Biden actually apologizes a lot. Joe Biden's also really good at grief. That's a different kind of emotional register than either Nixon or Trump. With Nixon, honestly, a lot of people thought it was maybe just that he was such an introvert, right? That other presidents are more relational. Nixon was very awkward around people. There's someone who works as like an assistant to one of his men who talks about how he was told never to address Nixon until he was properly introduced, like he would surprise him or something if he was in the room. And so they were like in an elevator together, and he was like pretending not to be there so that he wouldn't. So I don't know. I think that's not how all presidents have acted, even though the ego part is definitely a concern. Yeah. A lot of the other presidents also had different relationships with ministers, and so could have said they were sorry in a sort of confessional context. That Nixon, as I talk about a good bit in the book, like worked really hard to make sure that he never had those contexts, that he was never going to be in a situation where a minister would maybe make him say he was sorry for something.
Before we close, I want to get for a brief advertisement. Next September, the first person I've booked for our next season is author and minister David Zoll from Charlottesville, Virginia. And David's book, Low Anthropology, has been absolutely fantastic for me. And I strongly recommend it, and it resonates so much with what you're doing in this book. So keep your eyes out for our schedule for next fall.
The title again of the book?
Low Anthropology by David Zoll, Z-A-H-L. It's a great book, and he's going to be here with us next September. And we will be putting on our spring schedule soon. I'll give you more of a fulsome rundown on that at some stage. But please join me now in thanking Daniel Silliman.